Bob Dylan is one of the most mysterious figures in music history. For over 60 years, he's written songs that reshaped folk, rock, and even popular culture itself. But behind his cryptic lyrics and unpredictable career, Dylan has always drawn inspiration from the voices and sounds of others. The musicians he admired weren't always the most obvious choices. Some were towering icons, others were raw outsiders, but each one left a mark on him that would echo through his own work. What makes Dylan unique is that he never borrowed lightly. When he loved an artist, he studied them, their phrasing, their honesty, their way of telling a story. He absorbed their music until it became part of his own. But true to Dylan's restless spirit, he never copied anyone outright. Instead, he used their influence as fuel, reshaping it into something new, something unmistakably his. In this video, we're counting down the 8 artists and musicians Dylan himself held in the highest regard. From the mountain ballads of Appalachia to the harmonies of early rock and roll, from the lonesome twang of country to the electric revolution of the Beatles, these are the voices that helped Dylan find his own. So let's dive into the list. At number 8, we begin with a pair of Appalachian brothers whose raw harmonies carried the weight of American tradition and who taught Dylan what it meant to make every note count. Number 8, the Stanley Brothers. Before Bob Dylan was crowned the voice of a generation, he was just a teenager in Minnesota, sitting by a record player and falling under the spell of the Stanley Brothers. Carter and Ralph Stanley weren't mainstream stars, but their haunting harmonies and Appalachian roots music carried something ancient, a kind of raw truth that Dylan never forgot. Their songs sounded like they came from another world, carved out of mountains and back roads, yet they spoke directly to the heart. Carter Stanley's voice in particular stunned Dylan. It wasn't polished, it wasn't commercial, but it had a gravity that drew you in. Dylan once described voices like that as ancient bells ringing with pain, resilience, and memory. For him, the Stanley Brothers showed that music didn't need gloss to be powerful. It just needed honesty. Their influence can be heard in Dylan's early folk records, where his phrasing often carries the same raw edge and unvarnished delivery. Songs like Man of Constant Sorrow and In My Time of Dyin' trace directly back to the Appalachian tradition that the Stanleys embodied. Dylan wasn't just copying them. He was carrying their sound into a new era, weaving their mountain laments into the fabric of the 1960s folk revival. The Stanley Brothers also taught Dylan about the importance of storytelling. Their ballads weren't just melodies, they were short novels packed into 3 minutes, tales of loss, faith, and hard living. That kind of narrative songwriting would become one of Dylan's trademarks, from the lonesome death of Hattie Carroll to Tangled Up in Blue. Even decades later, Dylan continued to speak of the Stanleys with reverence. While the mainstream music world may not have ranked them alongside the Beatles or Elvis, Dylan knew their value. They were proof that greatness isn't measured in fame or sales, but in the weight of a voice and the truth of a song. The Stanley Brothers may not be household names today, but for Bob Dylan, they were a compass, pointing him toward authenticity, honesty, and the timeless power of American folk music. Number 7, the Everly Brothers. If the Stanley Brothers taught Bob Dylan the power of raw truth, the Everly Brothers showed him the magic of harmony. Don and Phil Everly were unlike anyone else in the 1950s, two voices that blended so seamlessly they sounded less like a duo and more like one person split in two. Dylan was mesmerized. He later said their harmonies were like one person with two souls, a perfect balance of intimacy and power. What drew Dylan in wasn't just their technique, but the way their voices carried emotion. Every line they sang felt close and personal, almost whispered into the listener's ear. Dylan, whose own voice was often rough and unconventional, learned that you didn't need to sound pretty to sound true. You needed to connect. The Everlys embody that lesson. Their influence is easy to trace. Dylan's melodic grace on songs like I Want You or Just Like a Woman owes something to the Everlys' knack for making a melody feel timeless. Even when he sang alone, Dylan often built his phrasing with an ear toward harmony, as if there were always another voice echoing in the background. The Everlys also carried rock and folk into new territory. They weren't blues purists or pop idols. They existed in between, blending traditions in a way that opened doors for artists like Dylan to do the same. Their songs showed him that music could be both accessible and profound, catchy and meaningful all at once. Decades later, Dylan still spoke of them with admiration. He inducted them into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and never downplayed their influence on his own journey. For someone who often kept his heroes close to the vest, that was no small praise. To Dylan, the Everly Brothers were proof that harmony could be more than just two voices blending. It could be a kind of alchemy, creating something bigger than either singer could manage alone. Number 6, Buddy Holly. Few moments in Bob Dylan's life left as deep a mark as the night he saw Buddy Holly perform live. It was just days before Holly's tragic plane crash in 1959, and Dylan, still an unknown teenager from Minnesota, stood in the audience watching a young artist who seemed to carry both confidence and vulnerability at once. That night stayed with him forever. Dylan often recalled the way Holly looked at him from the stage. He later said, "He looked me right straight dead in the eye, and he transmitted something. Something I didn't know what for Dylan it was more than a concert. It was a kind of passing of the torch." In that gaze, he felt both recognition and challenge, as if Holly was daring him to follow his own path. What struck Dylan most was Holly's independence. In an era when many artists were controlled by record labels and producers, Holly wrote his own songs, produced his own sessions, and played with a creative freedom that was rare at the time. Dylan took that spirit to heart, carrying it into his own career, as he fought to control his music and defy expectations. Musically, Holly's crisp guitar lines and clear, direct songwriting left their mark. Dylan didn't mimic his style, but he absorbed Holly's economy, the ability to say something powerful in just a few words. Holly proved that you didn't need grand statements to change music. Sometimes all it took was 3 chords and the truth. Even after decades of fame, Dylan never forgot that night. He spoke of it with awe, as if Holly's brief career had cast a shadow long enough to reach into his own work. When Dylan was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he mentioned Holly by name, crediting him as one of his deepest influences. For Dylan, Buddy Holly wasn't just a hero, he was a spark, a reminder that music could be personal, fearless, and life-changing, even in its simplest form. Number 5, Hank Williams. If Woody Guthrie was Bob Dylan's North Star, then Hank Williams was the raw heartbeat beneath it all. Dylan once called Hank the master of the universe, a songwriter whose music carried so much pain and beauty that it felt timeless. For Dylan, Williams was more than a country star. He was proof that music could cut straight to the bone with nothing but a voice, a melody, and the truth. What drew Dylan in was Williams's honesty. Songs like I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry and Your Cheatin' Heart didn't hide behind clever wordplay or polished arrangements. They were plain spoken, sometimes painfully so, and that simplicity carried more weight than any ornamentation could. Dylan learned that a song didn't have to be complicated to be profound. It had to be real. Williams also gave Dylan a model for writing that came directly from lived experience. Hank sang about heartache, loneliness, and longing in ways that were universal because they were personal. Dylan would adopt that same approach in his own music, crafting songs that felt both intimate and sweeping, specific yet universal. Even Dylan's vocal style, often criticized early in his career for its raw edges, carried something of Hank's unpolished delivery. Williams's voice wasn't smooth. It was full of cracks and imperfections that made it human. Dylan embraced that same quality, turning what some called a weakness into one of his greatest strengths. Throughout his career, Dylan returned to Hank Williams as a touchstone. In interviews, tributes, and even in his theme time radio hour broadcasts, he spoke of Williams with reverence. To Dylan, Hank wasn't just a songwriter, he was a truth teller, someone who laid bare the human condition without flinching. For Dylan, Hank Williams proved that the greatest music doesn't just entertain, it reveals. And that lesson would echo through nearly every song Dylan ever wrote. Number 4, the band. When Bob Dylan first went electric in 1965, the world was outraged. Folk purists booed, critics sneered, and some fans accused him of betraying his roots. But standing behind him on that fateful tour was a group of Canadian musicians who would soon become known simply as the band. For Dylan, they weren't just backup players. They became his musical blood brothers. Dylan admired their earthiness. Robbie Robertson, Levon Helm, Rick Danko, Richard Manuel, and Garth Hudson weren't chasing stardom or polish. They played with grit, humility, and a sense of tradition that reminded Dylan of the folk and country roots he loved. Together, they found a balance between experimentation and authenticity that reshaped rock music itself. Their collaborations became legendary. On Blonde and later in the basement sessions of Woodstock, Dylan and the band created music that was both timeless and revolutionary. Those informal recordings, later known as the basement tapes, showed Dylan at his most relaxed and playful, while the band grounded him with their instinctive chemistry. Dylan once called them the best band in the world, a rare moment of unguarded praise from a man not known for handing out compliments. He recognized in them a mirror of his own ideals, musicians who valued honesty, craft, and tradition over flash or fame. The band also influenced Dylan's songwriting. Their rootsy, stripped-down style inspired him to move away from the surrealism of Highway 61 Revisited and into the more grounded storytelling of albums like John Wesley Harding. In turn, Dylan's poetic daring helped the band carve out their own identity as one of the most respected groups of the era. For Dylan, the band weren't just collaborators, they were family. Together, they built a sound that bridged folk, country, and rock, and in the process, rewrote the rules of modern music. Number 3, Johnny Cash. Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash might have come from different worlds. Dylan from the folk clubs of New York, Cash from the country stages of the American South. But the two shared a deep bond rooted in respect. Dylan admired Cash's authenticity, his ability to sing about faith, hardship, and redemption without ever sounding false. Cash, in turn, saw in Dylan a kindred spirit who used simple words to express profound truths. Their friendship began in the 1960s when Cash defended Dylan during the backlash to his electric shift. At a time when critics and fans accused Dylan of abandoning folk, Cash wrote letters praising him and publicly called him one of the greatest songwriters alive. That kind of support meant the world to Dylan, who often kept his feelings close to the vest. Musically, Cash's influence can be heard in Dylan's own approach to plain-spoken storytelling. Songs like I Threw It All Away or Lay Lady Lay carry the same stripped-down honesty that defined much of Cash's work. Dylan didn't imitate him, but he learned from the way Cash could deliver heavy emotions with just a steady rhythm and a deep voice. The two also collaborated directly. Dylan appeared on the Johnny Cash Show in 1969, and the pair recorded a series of duets in Nashville. Though not all of those recordings were released, the sessions captured the mutual respect between two icons who saw music as something bigger than genre. Dylan often spoke warmly of Cash, praising his moral clarity and his refusal to compromise. To him, Cash wasn't just a country singer. He was a pillar of integrity, someone whose life and art were inseparable. For Dylan, Johnny Cash was more than a friend or collaborator. He was proof that music could be honest, brave, and unshakably true to its roots. Number 2, the Beatles. When Bob Dylan first heard the Beatles in the early 1960s, he wasn't impressed. To him, they sounded like bubblegum, catchy pop tunes with little depth. But as the years went on, Dylan watched them evolve into something much more daring. By the time they released Rubber Soul in 1965, Dylan admitted that the Beatles had become groundbreaking, rewriting what popular music could be. The relationship between Dylan and the Beatles was one of mutual influence. Dylan's early folk songs inspired John Lennon and Paul McCartney to write more serious lyrics, moving beyond teenage love songs into themes of identity, society, and philosophy. In turn, the Beatles' experiments with studio techniques and electric sound encouraged Dylan to take his own leap into rock, with Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61 revisited. Their friendship was legendary. Dylan famously introduced the Beatles to marijuana in 1964, sparking a creative shift that Lennon later said expanded their writing. But beyond those stories, there was a genuine respect. Lennon admired Dylan's uncompromising honesty, while Dylan envied the Beatles' ability to reach millions without losing their sense of adventure. Dylan often spoke with admiration about their creativity, particularly their ability to merge accessibility with artistry. He recognized that while they were global superstars, they never stopped pushing boundaries. For Dylan, that balance was nearly impossible, yet the Beatles managed to pull it off. Still, Dylan never put them on a pedestal. He respected their innovation, but he resisted the idea that they were untouchable. In his mind, they were fellow travelers, equals in the search for new sounds and new truths. For Dylan, the Beatles weren't just pop idols. They were proof that popular music could be as inventive and revolutionary as poetry. And that lesson stayed with him for the rest of his career. Number 1, Woody Guthrie. If there was one artist who shaped Bob Dylan more than any other, it was Woody Guthrie. Long before Dylan became the voice of the 1960s, he was a teenager in Minnesota, listening to Guthrie's scratchy recordings of This Land Is Your Land and Pastures of Plenty. To Dylan, Guthrie wasn't just a songwriter. He was a prophet, a man who turned everyday struggles into poetry and made music feel like a weapon for justice. In 1961, when Dylan arrived in New York, one of his first missions was to find Guthrie, who by then was gravely ill in a hospital battling Huntington's disease. Dylan visited him often, playing songs at his bedside, and even wrote his own tribute, Song to Woody, which appeared on his debut album. It wasn't just admiration, it was devotion. Dylan saw Guthrie as the living embodiment of everything he wanted to be. What Dylan admired most was Guthrie's honesty. Woody didn't write to be famous. He wrote to give a voice to the poor, the migrants, and the working class. His songs carried a raw, unfiltered power that Dylan tried to channel in his own protest anthems like Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin'. Guthrie also gave Dylan a sense of purpose. Through Guthrie, Dylan realized that music could be more than entertainment. It could be a force for change, a way to shake people awake and make them see the world differently. That idea became the foundation of Dylan's career, and one of the reasons he became the defining songwriter of his generation. Even after decades of reinvention, Dylan never stopped acknowledging Guthrie's influence. In interviews, tributes, and concerts, Guthrie's name appeared again and again, a constant reminder of where Dylan began and what still mattered most to him. For Dylan, Woody Guthrie wasn't just a favorite musician, he was the guiding light. The man who showed him that music, at its best, tells the truth and dares to change the world. From the mountain ballads of the Stanley Brothers to the fearless honesty of Woody Guthrie, each of these musicians left a mark on Bob Dylan that can still be heard in his songs today. They weren't just influences, they were guiding lights showing him new ways to phrase a lyric, deliver a melody, or tell the truth in 3 short minutes. What's striking is how wide-ranging Dylan's heroes were. Bluegrass harmonies, country laments, rock and roll pioneers, and larger-than-life icons, he drew from all of them. But instead of imitating, Dylan absorbed their lessons and transformed them into something entirely his own. His genius wasn't in copying, it was in reshaping. Even at the height of his fame, Dylan never pretended to exist in a vacuum. He admitted freely that his music was built on the foundations of those who came before him. In many ways, that humility is part of what kept his art so alive. He always remained a student, even as he became a master. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Bob Dylan's favorite musicians weren't just the soundtrack to his youth or the stepping stones to his career. They were reminders that music is a conversation across time, one voice sparking another, one song leading to the next. So as we look back on Dylan's incredible journey, we also look at the 8 names who helped shape it. Without them, there would be no Blowin' in the Wind, no Like a Rolling Stone, no Dylan as we know him, because even the greatest songwriter of the 20th century started as a listener, a young man leaning in close to the record player, hearing voices that would change his life forever.